Welcome to another journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the line between documented fact and unexplained terror becomes impossibly thin. I'm your host, and before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to ask you something. Take a moment and tell me in the comments below, where are you watching this from, and what time is it in your location right now? Are you alone? There's something about these stories that feels different depending on when and where you encounter them. Your answers help me understand our growing community of truth seekers. Now let me take you back to 1851, the rural outskirts of Valdosta, Georgia, a time when the American South was built on the backs of enslaved people, when human beings were bought and sold like livestock, their stories erased, their voices silenced. Most of those stories remain buried in unmarked graves and destroyed records. But every so often, something surfaces. A name. A series of events so disturbing that even those who tried to forget couldn't help but write them down. This is the story of Eliza Mae, a woman whose very existence became a legend whispered among slaveholders across 3 counties, a woman no master could keep for more than 3 weeks, not because she ran away, not because she died, but because of what happened to those who tried to own her. The historical record is fragmented, deliberately so, but what remains is enough to piece together something that defies easy explanation. Slave. Auction records from Lowndes County show a pattern that should have been impossible. Between March 1849 and November 1851, a woman matching Eliza's description was sold 17 times. 17 times in less than 3 years. Each sale document bears notes in the margins, warnings, crossed-out prices. One bill of sale, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, contains a single handwritten line beneath her description. Buyer assumes all risk. No returns accepted under any circumstances. What kind of risk requires that disclaimer? What could make experienced plantation owners, men who built fortunes on the systematic brutalization of human beings, too afraid to keep one woman? The answer begins with Thomas Crowley, age 42, owner of a 200-acre cotton plantation just west of Valdosta, a man known for his cruelty, even by the standards of his time. Local records describe him as ruthless, calculating, and utterly without sentiment. He had purchased over 30 enslaved people in his lifetime. He knew the system inside and out. He feared nothing and no one. In August 1851, Crowley attended an estate sale in Quitman. The Hendricks plantation was being liquidated after the owner's mysterious death. Most of the enslaved people were purchased quickly, but one woman remained, mid-20s, physically healthy, no obvious disabilities. The auctioneer kept lowering her price, $50, $40, $25. Still, no one bid. Crowley approached the auctioneer and asked why such a young, capable worker was being practically given away. The auctioneer's response was recorded in a letter Crowley later wrote to his brother. He told me she carried darkness with her, that animals died in her presence, that Hendricks himself had gone mad trying to break her. I laughed at his superstition. I paid $15 for her, the cheapest purchase I ever made. It would also be his last. Eliza Mae arrived at the Crowley plantation on August 14th, 1851. She spoke rarely, made no attempts to escape, followed orders without resistance. For 3 days, everything seemed normal. Thomas Crowley wrote in his journal, preserved now in the Lowndes County Historical Archive, "The negress Eliza works adequately. The other slaves avoid her, which suits me fine. Less distraction, less trouble." On the 4th night, something changed. Crowley's wife, Margaret, woke screaming. She told her husband she had dreamed of chains pulling her underground, while a woman's voice whispered in a language she couldn't understand. Thomas dismissed it as nerves, but the next morning, They discovered that 12 chickens in the coop had died overnight. No marks, no signs of disease or predation, just dead, arranged in a perfect circle. The pattern had begun, and the Crowleys had no idea what was waiting for them in the darkness of their own property. What they would find in their barn 3 nights later would change everything. To understand what happened at the Crowley plantation, we need to understand the world that created it. The year 1851 marked a critical moment in American history. The Compromise of 1850 had just been passed, including the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it a federal crime to assist enslaved people seeking freedom. The South was tightening its grip. Cotton was king, and Georgia was one of its primary kingdoms. Lowndes County, Georgia, in 1851, was a frontier of sorts. The land had been seized from the Creek Nation less than 20 years earlier. The soil was rich, the growing season was long, and the economy depended entirely on enslaved labor. Census records from 1850 show that Lowndes County had a population of approximately 3,200 people. Of those, nearly 1,800 were enslaved. The white population lived in constant fear of rebellion, of losing control, of the very people they brutalized rising up against them. This fear manifested in brutal suppression. Whippings were public. Families were separated as punishment. Any sign of resistance, any hint of spiritual practice that fell outside approved Christian worship, was met with immediate and savage violence. The Valdosta Southern Times, a weekly newspaper that ran from 1847 to 1863, regularly published notices about dangerous Negroes and warnings about African superstitions that supposedly threatened the social order. One editorial from March 1851, just 5 months before Eliza arrived at the Crowley plantation, reads, "The planters of this county must remain vigilant against the poisonous influence of heathen practices brought from the dark continent. These people carry with them beliefs that have no place in a Christian society. Root work, conjuring, and communication with spirits are tools of Satan and must be stamped out wherever discovered." But here's what the plantation owners didn't understand, or perhaps refused to acknowledge. For enslaved people, these spiritual practices weren't just religious beliefs. They were survival tools, weapons without blades, resistance without rebellion. When you strip people of everything, when you deny them their language, their names, their families, they hold on to what you cannot see, what you cannot touch, what you cannot destroy with chains and whips. The Crowley family embodied the plantation aristocracy of South Georgia. Thomas Crowley's father had been an overseer in South Carolina before moving to Georgia in 1828. Thomas inherited his father's land hunger and cruelty. He married Margaret Whitfield in 1840, a woman from an established Valdosta family. They had 3 children, James, age 9, Catherine, age 7, and infant Mary, just 14 months old, in August 1851. The Crowley plantation house was a modest 2-story structure, white-painted wood with a wraparound porch. Behind it stood the work buildings, barns, storage sheds, a blacksmith's forge, and a cotton gin. Further back, barely visible from the main house, were the slave quarters, 12 cramped cabins, housing 31 enslaved people. Their names appear in Crowley's property ledgers like livestock: Tom, age 40, field hand; Sarah, age 35, cook; Joshua, age 17, stable hand. Human beings reduced to lines in an account book. Letters from Margaret Crowley to her sister in Savannah, preserved in the Whitfield family collection at the Georgia State Archives, paint a picture of plantation life. In one letter dated July 1851, she writes, "The heat is unbearable, dear sister. The children are restless. Thomas speaks of nothing but cotton prices and labor efficiency. Sometimes I wonder if we made a mistake settling so far from civilized society. The isolation weighs on me. At night, I hear the Negroes singing in their quarters. strange melodies that sound nothing like the hymns we teach them in Sunday services. Thomas forbids me from mentioning it, but those songs trouble my sleep. Those songs were more than just music. They were coded messages, warnings, prayers in languages that predated the slave ships, and according to later testimonies from enslaved people who survived the Crowley plantation, Eliza Mae's arrival changed those songs, made them darker, more urgent. The broader community around Valdosta was small and insular. Everyone knew everyone's business. Gossip traveled fast, and by the summer of 1851, Eliza Mae's reputation had traveled faster. Plantation owners would gather at the Valdosta courthouse on Saturdays for auctions and business. The general store served as an informal meeting place, and the topic that dominated conversation was always the same: profit, control, and the constant management of human property. It was in this environment that Thomas Crowley made his fateful purchase. Other plantation owners had warned him. Not directly, of course. Southern gentlemen didn't speak openly of fear, but the warnings were there in the coded language of their world. "That one's got a spirit in her," one planter supposedly told him. "Not worth the trouble, Tom. Not worth any price." But Thomas Crowley didn't believe in spirits. He believed in dominance, in control, in the absolute power of one man over another. His journal entries from early August 1851 reveal his mindset. "These people are like animals. They can be trained, broken, made useful. The superstitious nonsense that circulates among the weaker planters is an embarrassment to rational men. Fear is a tool to control the slave, not something that should ever affect the master." He was wrong, and by the time he realized it, it was already too late. Contemporary accounts from the enslaved community paint a different picture of those early days. In 1937, as part of the Federal Writers Project, an elderly woman named Ruth Collins was interviewed about her grandmother's experiences. Her grandmother, Susan, had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation in 1851. Ruth recalled, "Grandmama told me about the woman who came to Crowley's place that August. Said the other slaves knew. Something was different about her the moment she arrived. She didn't look at nobody directly, kept her eyes down, but you could feel her watching. And at night, they'd hear her singing in a language none of them recognized. Not English, not African words they knew. Something older, something that made the air feel heavy." The stage was set. A brutal plantation owner convinced of his own invincibility, an enslaved woman carrying something none of them understood, and a community about to witness events that would haunt the county for generations. Within a week of Eliza's arrival, the first truly inexplicable events began, and they would only escalate from there. The first week of Eliza Mae's presence at the Crowley plantation passed with an eerie calm. She worked in the fields during the day, picking cotton alongside the other enslaved workers. She ate her meager rations in silence. She slept in the cabin assigned to her, sharing the cramped space with 3 other women. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual, but beneath that surface something was already shifting. Thomas Crowley's journal entry from August 18, 1851, 4 days after Eliza's arrival, notes, "The new Negro woman works adequately, but the others give her wide berth. I've noticed she hums while working, not hymns, something else. I've instructed the overseer to correct this behavior if it continues." But it wasn't just humming. Sarah, the plantation cook, would later tell her daughter, who would tell her, a daughter who would eventually share the story with WPA interviewers in 1937. "Miss Eliza, she didn't just hum, she was calling something. We all knew it. The old folks who remembered Africa, they recognized some of the words. They said it was a language from before the boats, from before the chains. They said she was talking to the ones who died in the water." On August 19th, the morning after the 12 dead chickens were discovered, Thomas Crowley ordered his overseer, a man named Pike Henderson, to investigate. Henderson's report, preserved in Crowley's papers, is brief. No evidence of predators, no signs of disease, no poisoning detected. The Negroes claim they heard singing from the direction of the slave quarters around midnight. Cannot confirm. Margaret Crowley's nightmares continued. Her letter to her sister, dated August 21st, describes them in disturbing detail. I wake each night at the same hour, 3 in the morning exactly. I dream of water closing over my head. I dream of hands pulling me down. And always there is a voice. A woman's voice speaking words I cannot understand, but somehow know are meant for me. Thomas says I am overwrought, that the summer heat is affecting my nerves. But sister, I am not imagining this. Last night all 3 of our children woke screaming at the same moment, 3 in the morning. All of them described the same dream. Water, chains, a voice in the darkness. The livestock began dying on August 22nd. 3 goats were found dead in their pen. Like the chickens, there were no marks, no signs of struggle. They simply died. The plantation veterinarian, Dr. Charles Whitmore, examined the carcasses and wrote in his notes, "Cause of death, unknown. Hearts appear to have simply stopped. No disease present. Most peculiar case I have encountered in 20 years of practice." That same day, 2 field hands collapsed while working. They recovered after a few hours, but both reported the same experience. As they worked the rows near where Eliza was picking, they felt suddenly cold despite the August heat. Their vision darkened, and they heard whispering as if dozens of voices were speaking just behind them. When they turned, no one was there. Thomas Crowley was not a man easily disturbed, but his journal entries began to change in tone. August 23rd. Something is affecting the morale of the workers. Productivity has decreased by nearly 30% this week. Several have requested transfers to work. Further from the new woman, "This is unacceptable. I have made it clear that such requests will be met with punishment." But punishment didn't stop what was happening. It only made it worse. On the night of August 24th, Pike Henderson, the overseer, decided to investigate the slave quarters himself. He hid in the shadows after sundown to observe. What he saw, he would later describe in a sworn statement to the local sheriff, though the statement itself is oddly missing from official records. A copy survived in Henderson's personal effects, discovered by his great-grandson in 1978. Henderson wrote, "I observed the woman Eliza exit her cabin approximately 1 hour after dark. She walked to the clearing behind the quarters where the workers sometimes gather. She knelt on the ground and began drawing symbols in the dirt with her finger. I could not make out the shapes clearly from my position. She sang in a low voice for perhaps 15 minutes. Then the most disturbing thing occurred. The other Negroes, still inside their cabins, began singing as well. The same melody, the same words, as if they were all connected by some invisible thread. I confess, sir, that I felt compelled to leave. A coldness came over me that had nothing to do with the temperature, and I swear, though I know how this sounds, I saw shadows moving around her that had no source, shadows that stood upright like men but cast no reflection in the moonlight." Thomas Crowley's response to this report was documented in a letter to his brother. "Henderson is either drunk or a coward, likely both. I will not tolerate this superstitious foolishness. Tomorrow I will address the woman myself." Before we continue, I want to pause here and ask you something. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is Eliza Mae truly practicing some form of spiritual power? Is this mass hysteria among people conditioned by fear and isolation? Or is there something else at work here? Something that defies both rational explanation and supernatural interpretation? Your theories matter. Share them below. On the morning of August 25th, Thomas Crowley confronted Eliza Mae directly. According to his journal, she was working in the cotton field when he approached her. He demanded to know what she was doing at night, what songs she was singing, what symbols she was drawing in the dirt. Her response was documented in his journal, one of the few times her actual words were recorded. "I am remembering, Master. I am calling to those who came before. I am making sure they are not forgotten." Crowley ordered her whipped, 10 lashes, standard punishment for insubordination. The whipping was carried out by Pike Henderson in front of the other enslaved workers, a common practice meant to instill fear and maintain control. But here's where the documented accounts become truly disturbing. Multiple witnesses, including Henderson himself, reported that Eliza Mae did not cry out during the whipping. She did not beg for mercy. She simply stood, silent, accepting each strike. And when it was over, when her back was bleeding and torn, she turned to Thomas Crowley and spoke again. What she said is recorded in 3 separate sources: Crowley's journal, Henderson's statement, and the testimony of an enslaved man named Moses who was standing nearby. All 3 accounts match word for word. "The water remembers, Master, and the water is coming for you." That night, the Crowley family dog, a hunting hound named Rex that Thomas had owned for 7 years, went mad. It attacked its own reflection in a window, then ran into the woods howling. It was never seen again. The next morning, August 26th, the overseer Pike Henderson did not report for work. His wife found him in their cabin, curled in a corner, muttering to himself. He refused to return to the Crowley plantation. He quit his position that very day, forfeiting 3 months' wages. When pressed for an explanation, he would only say, "I've seen enough. That woman is not right, and whatever she's calling, it's answering." Thomas Crowley now faced a crisis. His livestock was dying. His workers were terrified. His overseer had abandoned his post, and worst of all, he could feel it himself now. The cold, the whispers, the sense that something was watching from the shadows of his own property. On August 27th, 2 weeks after Eliza Mae's arrival, he made a decision. He would not be beaten by a slave woman. He would not succumb to fear. He would break her, whatever it took. He ordered her moved from the slave quarters to a storage shed behind the main barn, a building with a heavy lock, no windows. He would isolate her completely, deprive her of food until she submitted, until she confessed what she was doing, until she stopped. But isolation would prove to be a terrible mistake, because what Thomas Crowley didn't understand was that Eliza Mae didn't need people to practice her craft. She didn't need tools or materials. All she needed was darkness, time, and something that already existed beneath his land, something very old, something very hungry. And then, on the 13th night, the screaming began. On the night of August 28, 1851, exactly 13 days after Eliza Mae arrived at the Crowley plantation, something fundamental changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour, unusual even for a late summer evening in Georgia. A fog rolled in from the nearby swamps, thick and unnatural, carrying with it the smell of standing water and decay. Thomas Crowley was in his study, going over his account books, trying to calculate the losses he'd suffered since Eliza's arrival. Margaret was upstairs with the children, all of whom had developed fevers that afternoon. The enslaved workers were confined to their quarters under strict orders not to leave until morning. At approximately 10:47 p.m., according to the clock in Crowley's study, which stopped at that exact moment and never worked again, the screaming began. It came from the storage shed where Eliza was locked. But it wasn't her voice. It was multiple voices, dozens of voices, men, women, children, all screaming in unison. The sound was so loud that neighbors over a mile away reported hearing it. Samuel Morton, who owned the adjacent property, wrote in a letter to his cousin, "It sounded like every soul that ever died on these plantations was crying out at once." My wife fainted. My children hid under their beds. It lasted for nearly 30 minutes without pause. Thomas Crowley grabbed his rifle and ran toward the shed. What he found when he arrived would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. The heavy padlock he'd installed was still locked, but the door stood wide open. The hinges had been torn from the inside, the wood splintered outward as if struck by tremendous force. But Eliza Mae was still inside, sitting calmly in the center of the dirt floor. Around her, drawn in what appeared to be blood, were symbols, complex geometric patterns interspersed with representations of chains, ships, and human figures. Some of the symbols matched traditional West African spiritual iconography that researchers would later identify as Vodun and Akan religious markings, but others matched nothing in any known tradition. They appeared older, stranger. Crowley's journal entry from that night is one of the most disturbing documents in the entire case file. His handwriting, normally precise and controlled, became erratic. Several words are crossed out. Some sentences are unfinished. He wrote, "I pointed the rifle at her and demanded to know what devilry this was. She looked at me with eyes that seemed black in the lamplight. Not just dark, black, empty. She said, 'They are here now, Master, the ones who died on the ships, the ones who died in your fields, the ones who died giving birth to children you sold away. They are all here now, and they are so very hungry.'" Thomas Crowley, the man who prided himself on his rationality and control, did something he had never done before. He ran back to the main house. He barricaded the doors. He loaded every weapon he owned, and he waited for dawn. But dawn brought no relief. It brought only the discovery of what had happened while the family cowered inside. Every single animal on the plantation was dead. 43 cattle, 27 pigs, 68 chickens, 17 goats, 3 horses, all dead, all arranged in circles. Around the perimeter of the property, no marks on any of them. Hearts simply stopped, and in the center of each circle, drawn in the dirt, was the same symbol. A chain broken in the middle, with water flowing through the break. The morning of August 29th marked the beginning of Thomas Crowley's complete unraveling. He sent an urgent message to Reverend William Ashford, the pastor of Valdosta First Baptist Church, begging him to come to the plantation immediately. The letter, preserved in church records, is nearly illegible. "Something evil has taken root here. I need prayers. I need help. For God's sake, come quickly before we are all damned." Reverend Ashford arrived that afternoon, accompanied by 2 church elders. What they witnessed, they documented in an official church report filed on September 2nd, 1851. The report was discovered in 1982 during renovation of the church basement, hidden behind a false wall. It had been deliberately concealed. The Reverend wrote, "Upon arrival at the Crowley plantation, we found the family in a state of extreme distress. Mrs. Crowley would not stop weeping. The children were feverish and speaking in tongues I could not identify. Mr. Crowley himself appeared to have aged a decade in a matter of days. His hands shook, his eyes were bloodshot. He took us to see the Negro woman Eliza, locked once again in the shed, though how they managed to return her there he did not explain. When we entered, prepared to perform an exorcism, the woman simply smiled at us. She spoke in perfect English, which Mr. Crowley insisted she had rarely done before. 'Your prayers have no power here, Reverend. Your God does not recognize this place. The soil is soaked with too much blood, too many tears. The old gods, the ones my people brought in chains, they are awake now, and they will have what is owed.' Reverend Ashford attempted to pray over her. He read from Psalms. He commanded in the name of Jesus that any demon possessing her depart. According to his report, Eliza Mae listened patiently until he finished. Then she began to sing. the same melody that had been heard throughout the plantation, and as she sang, the three men reported feeling an overwhelming pressure, as if the air itself was pressing down on them. One of the church elders, Benjamin Clark, collapsed. Blood began running from his nose and ears. They fled. 3 ordained men of God fled from an unarmed, malnourished, enslaved woman. That evening, Thomas Crowley made his most desperate decision yet. If spiritual intervention wouldn't work, he would try physical destruction. He would burn the shed with Eliza still inside. He would end this, whatever the cost. But when he and 3 enslaved men he forced to help him approach the shed at dusk, they found it empty. The lock was still secure, the door was closed, but Eliza Mae was gone. And written on the wall in what appeared to be charcoal were words in English. "You cannot burn water. You cannot chain the D. Drowned. We are here. We have always been here. And now we take what was stolen." The search for Eliza Mae lasted 3 days. Every inch of the plantation was examined. The surrounding woods were combed by volunteers from neighboring plantations, men who feared that whatever was happening at the Crowley property might spread. But no trace of her was found. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the air. On September 1st, 1851, one of the enslaved workers, a man named Samuel, was digging a new irrigation ditch near the western edge of the property when his shovel struck something hard. Not stone, not clay. Wood. What Samuel had found would change everything. Beneath 3 feet of Georgia soil was a door, a wooden hatch, weathered and ancient, leading down into darkness. Thomas Crowley was summoned. Against every instinct, against every warning his body was screaming at him, he ordered the hatch opened. Below was a cellar, but not a cellar he had built, not a cellar that appeared on any property survey or deed. This structure predated his ownership, predated his father's arrival in Georgia. The walls were stone, fitted together with techniques that suggested significant age. And inside, hanging from the walls, were chains. Dozens of chains, rusted. Some still bore fragments of cloth, some still bore worse things. In the center of the cellar floor was a well, a stone well that dropped down into absolute darkness. The smell rising from it was overwhelming. Decay, stagnant, water, and something else, something organic and wrong. Thomas Crowley's journal entry from that day is the last coherent entry he ever made. "We lowered a lamp into the well. The light descended for what seemed like minutes. When it finally reached the bottom, we saw water, black water, and floating in that water were bones, human bones, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, and swimming among them, I swear to God, I saw movement, something pale, something that looked up at the light with eyes, that caught the reflection like an animal. We pulled the lamp back up immediately, but I know what I saw. Something lives in that water, something that has been fed. For how long, I cannot say, but I know now what Eliza Mae meant. The water remembers, and it is hungry." Historical records show that this area of Georgia had been inhabited by Creek and Seminole peoples before their forced removal in the 1830s. Some archaeological evidence suggests earlier inhabitants as well, dating back centuries. What if this well, this underground chamber, was older than the plantation, older than European arrival? What if enslaved people, stolen from their homelands, had found something here that connected to their old beliefs? What if they had fed it, sustained it with their prayers and their rage? Or perhaps there was a more horrible explanation. Perhaps the bones in that well were those of enslaved people themselves, murdered, hidden, and Eliza Mae had found a way to give them voice. The next morning, September 2nd, Thomas Crowley's eldest son, James, disappeared. The boy was last seen playing in the yard near the main house. A search was organized immediately. 200 men from surrounding plantations combed the property. They searched for 3 days. On September 5th, they found him at the bottom of the well, his body floating among the bones. But here's what made no sense. The hatch had been sealed. A heavy stone had been rolled over it. It would have taken several grown men to move. James Crowley was 9 years old, and according to the physician who examined his body, Dr. Whitmore, the boy had been dead for at least 2 days before he entered the water. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He had died before going into the well. Someone or something had placed him there afterward. Thomas Crowley never recovered from finding his son in that well. His journal entries after September 5th are barely legible. Random words, fragments of thoughts. The water rises. She sings from below. They all come back. Cannot sleep. The chains rattle in empty rooms. Margaret Crowley took the 2 remaining children and fled to her sister's house in Savannah on September 7th. She left a note for her husband, discovered later among his papers, "I will not stay in this cursed place one more night. Come with us, Thomas, I beg you. Whatever you have awakened, you cannot control it. That woman was a warning we failed to heed. Now our son is dead. I will not lose the others. Leave this place, burn it to the ground, but leave." Thomas Crowley did not leave. Perhaps pride kept him there, perhaps guilt, or perhaps by then something else had taken hold of him. The enslaved people fled as well. Within 3 days of James's death, all 31 of them had run. Normally, runaways were hunted, captured, punished, but no one went after them. No one wanted to step foot on the Crowley plantation anymore. On September 12th, exactly 1 month after Eliza Mae's arrival, Reverend Ashford made one final visit to the plantation at the urging of Margaret Crowley. He found Thomas alone in the main house. The Reverend's private diary, donated to the Georgia Historical Society by his descendants in 1965, describes what he witnessed. "Thomas Crowley is not the man I knew. He sits in his parlor surrounded by open Bibles, though I do not think he is reading them. His eyes are unfocused. His skin is pale as death. When I asked him to leave this place, he laughed, a horrible broken sound. He said, 'Leave? Reverend, it's far too late for that. She's still here, you know. I see her at night, standing at the edge of the property, and behind her there are others. So many others. The ones from the well. The ones from every plantation in this county. They're all gathering here. This is where it ends. Where it must end.' I tried to reason with him, but he would not be moved. As I prepared to depart, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. He said, 'Tell them what happened here. Tell them that we took everything from these people, their freedom, their names, their children, their lives. We thought we owned them, but you can't own souls, Reverend. And souls remember, souls have weight, and that weight pulls down, down into the dark water, where all debts are paid.' I left him there. God forgive me. I left him there. But I could feel it too by then. The heaviness in the air, the sense that the land itself was watching, waiting. Thomas Crowley was found dead on September 19th, 1851. A neighboring farmer, concerned after seeing no activity at the plantation for days, ventured onto the property with the local sheriff. They discovered Thomas in the cellar, lying beside the well. His eyes were open. His mouth was open. He appeared to have drowned, though there was no water in his lungs. The medical examiner noted, "Cause of death unknown. Body shows signs consistent with drowning, skin pruning, foam in airways, yet lungs are completely dry, impossible, yet observed." But the most disturbing detail came from the sheriff's official report. When they found Thomas's body, he was not alone in the cellar. Standing in the shadows, watching them, was Eliza Mae, still alive, still calm, still smiling. When the sheriff demanded to know what had happened, she said only this, recorded in his report, "The debt is paid. The water has its due. I'll be going now." She walked past them, up the stairs, out of the cellar, across the plantation grounds, and disappeared into the woods. The sheriff made no attempt to stop her. He later wrote, "I am not ashamed to admit I was afraid. Whatever that woman is, Whatever power she possesses, it is beyond my understanding or authority. Let her go. Let this cursed place be forgotten." The Crowley plantation was abandoned. Margaret Crowley never returned. She sold the property for almost nothing to a land speculator who never developed it. The main house burned down in 1854 under mysterious circumstances. The slave quarters collapsed. The fields returned to wilderness, and the cellar with its ancient well was sealed with concrete in 1889 by order of the county, after 3 children from a neighboring farm disappeared and were found drowned in a creek half a mile away, their pockets filled with bones that DNA testing in 2003 would confirm were over 150 years old. What they discovered in that cellar wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was proof of something far more disturbing. Proof that history has weight, that suffering leaves marks, and that sometimes, just sometimes, those marks become doorways through which the drowned can return. For nearly a century, the story of Eliza Mae and the Crowley plantation faded into local legend, whispered stories, cautionary tales told to frighten children. The land itself remained undeveloped, avoided by those who knew its history. But historical truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. And, beginning in the 1950s, fragments began to emerge, pieces of evidence that suggested the story was far more than folklore. In June 1956, a graduate student named Robert Hendricks was researching antebellum plantation records at the University of Georgia when he discovered something unusual in the Lowndes County archives. A series of bills of sale for an enslaved woman matching Eliza Mae's description, spanning from 1849 to 1851. What caught Hendricks' attention was the pattern: 17 sales in less than 3 years, and with each sale the price dropped. The final sale to Thomas Crowley was listed at $15, an impossibly low amount for a healthy adult worker. Hendricks' master's thesis, Anomalies in Georgia Slave Trade Records, 1845-1855, devoted an entire chapter to this case. He wrote, "The economic irrationality of these transactions suggests factors beyond normal market forces. Annotations on several bills of sale reference unusual circumstances and buyer, assumption of risk." One document contains a note in the margin, seemingly added years later, that reads, "This woman should never have been sold, should have been drowned like the others." The meaning of this cryptic statement remains unclear, but it suggests a darker history than official records indicate. Hendricks attempted to trace Eliza Mae's origins. He found her first recorded sale in Charleston, South Carolina, in March 1849. The bill of sale listed her as Eliza, approximately 26 years of age, origin unknown, no living family, acquired from estate liquidation. But when Hendricks searched for the estate in question, he found no records. It was as if she had appeared from nowhere. His thesis was accepted but never published. Hendricks died in a car accident in 1958, just 2 years after completing his research. His papers were donated to the Georgia Historical Society, where they sat largely ignored for decades. The next significant discovery came in 1967. A man named James Whitfield, great-grandson of Margaret Crowley's sister, was cleaning out his grandmother's attic in Savannah when he discovered a wooden box containing letters. Among them were Margaret Crowley's correspondence from 1851, including the letters describing the events at the plantation. But there was one additional item in that box that had never been mentioned in any historical account. A diary. Small, leather-bound, water-damaged, written in Margaret Crowley's hand. The diary entries from August and September 1851 provided details that never made it into her letters. In one entry, dated August 30th, Margaret wrote, "I saw her tonight. Eliza. She was standing in our bedroom. Thomas was asleep beside me, but I was awake. She stood at the foot of our bed and looked at me with such sadness, not anger, sadness. She said, "Your husband took my children from me. 3 times I gave birth. 3 times he sold them before I could even name them. The water remembers their names, even if you have forgotten yours." Then she was gone. But in the morning I found 3 drops of water on the floor where she had stood. In a room on the 2nd story of our house, 3 drops of water that smelled of the ocean. The diary also contained a confession that explained much about Margaret's immediate flight from the plantation. On September 6th, the day after her son's body was found, she wrote, "I know why this is happening. Thomas is not the only guilty one. I have looked the other way for 12 years. I have accepted the wealth built on suffering. I have worn dresses sewn by hands I refuse to see as human. I have raised my children on food prepared by women whose own children were torn from them. I am complicit. We are all complicit. And Eliza Mae is not a demon. She is a reckoning. She is every mother who was robbed, every soul who was chained, every body thrown overboard during the Middle Passage. She carries them all within her, and they want what was taken, our children, our peace, our lives, everything." The diary ended there. No further entries were ever written. In 1973, an archaeological survey team from Valdosta State College conducted a study of historic plantation sites in Lowndes County. When they reached the location of the former Crowley plantation, they encountered immediate problems. Equipment malfunctioned. Compasses spun randomly. 2 team members became violently ill and had to be hospitalized. The team leader, Dr. Patricia Chen, wrote in her field notes, "This site exhibits unusual electromagnetic properties that I cannot explain. Additionally, 3 separate GPR scans indicated a large underground structure beneath the western edge of the property. When we attempted to excavate, we found the concrete seal from 1889. We were advised by local residents not to break the seal. After the equipment failures and illnesses, we decided to honor their advice." But the most compelling evidence came from the Federal Writers' Project interviews, conducted in the 1930s. As mentioned earlier, these interviews captured oral histories from formerly enslaved people and their descendants. Several interviews from South Georgia reference "The Woman Who Drowned the Masters" or "The Water Witch of Valdosta." These weren't just isolated stories. They formed a consistent narrative across multiple testimonies. One interview, conducted in 1938 with an elderly man named Thomas Freeman in Quitman, Georgia, stands out. Freeman was 93 years old and claimed his mother had been enslaved on a plantation near the Crowley property. He said, "My mama told me about Miss Eliza, said she came from the water originally, said when she was born, her mama died in childbirth on a slave ship crossing the ocean. The midwife on that ship, another captured woman, she took the baby and whispered something in her ear. Some words from the old country, words of power, words of memory. And from that day, that baby carried all the drowned ones inside her. Every person who was thrown overboard, every person who jumped rather than faced chains, they all lived in her. And when she got tired of suffering, she called them up, called them from the deep water, and they came." In 1982, a historian named Dr. Ellen Morrison published a book titled Hidden Voices: Enslaved Women's Resistance in the Antebellum South. One chapter examined spiritual practices as forms of resistance. Dr. Morrison had uncovered references to Eliza Mae in 7 different historical sources, including church records, plantation journals, and WPA interviews. She concluded, "Whether Eliza Mae possessed genuine supernatural abilities or simply understood how to weaponize superstition against her oppressors, the result was the same. She destroyed a plantation system through fear. She reclaimed agency in a world designed to strip her of all power. Her story represents a unique form of resistance that historians have largely overlooked." But Dr. Morrison's research also uncovered something troubling. She attempted to trace what happened to Eliza Mae after September 1851. She found scattered references. A woman matching her description appearing at plantations across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi between 1851 and 1863. Each appearance followed the same pattern: strange deaths, livestock dying, families abandoning their land, and always, always water, wells overflowing, creeks flooding, rain that wouldn't stop. The last confirmed sighting was in Natchez, Mississippi in May 1863 during the siege of Vicksburg. A Confederate officer's diary mentioned a Negro woman who walks through our camps at night singing in a foreign tongue. The men fear her. Several have deserted. She seems to bring the water with her. Wherever she walks, the ground becomes soft, muddy, as if the earth itself is weeping. After that, nothing. Eliza Mae disappeared from the historical record entirely. Some believe she died during the war. Others claim she simply walked into a river one day and never emerged. And some, those who believe the more supernatural aspects of her story, say she never died at all, that she's still out there, moving through the South, carrying the memories of the drowned, waiting for the final reckoning. In 1995, during renovation of the Lowndes County courthouse, a sealed envelope was discovered behind a wall panel. Inside was a photograph, dated 1891. The photograph showed a group of people standing near a river, and on the edge of the frame, partially obscured by shadow, was a woman. Her face was unclear, but written on the back of the photograph in faded ink were the words, "Still here, still watching, still remembering." The photograph is now housed in the Georgia archives. You can request to view it, but staff members report that something is wrong with it. No matter how carefully it's stored, water damage continues to spread across the image, as if the photograph itself is slowly drowning. So what really happened at the Crowley plantation in the summer of 1851? What was Eliza Mae? And more importantly, where is she now? The truth is, we may never know for certain. History has a way of hiding its darkest corners, especially when those corners reveal uncomfortable truths about who we were and what we built our society upon. But we can examine the possibilities. We can look at the evidence that remains and draw our own conclusions. Theory 1. Eliza Mae was a practitioner of genuine spiritual power, carrying with her traditions that survived the Middle Passage. In West African religions, particularly Vodun and various Akan spiritual practices, there exists the concept of ancestral memory and the power of the drowned. Water is seen as a conduit between worlds, a threshold where the living and dead can communicate. If Eliza Mae had been trained in these traditions, if she had survived the trauma of enslavement while maintaining her spiritual knowledge, she could have tapped into something very real. The deaths, the visions, the terror that consumed the Crowley family might have been the result of forces we simply don't understand, forces that science cannot measure, but that exist nonetheless in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Theory 2. Eliza Mae was a brilliant psychological manipulator who understood that in a world built on terror, terror could be turned into a weapon. She may have used her knowledge of herbs, poisons, and natural phenomena to create the illusion of supernatural power. A woman who had lost everything might find strength in making her oppressors believe she was something they couldn't control. The livestock deaths could have been poisoning. The nightmares could have been suggestion and mass hysteria. The symbols and rituals could have been theater, performed for an audience already primed by guilt and superstition to see demons, where there were only desperate humans fighting back in the only way available to them. In this interpretation, Eliza Mae was not a supernatural being, but something perhaps more remarkable, a resistance fighter who weaponized belief itself. Theory 3. The truth lies somewhere between these extremes. Perhaps Eliza Mae did practice spiritual traditions from her ancestors, Perhaps she did believe she was channeling the drowned. But perhaps the real power wasn't supernatural at all. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of suffering, the psychological toll of centuries of atrocity, the guilt that must have haunted even the most hardened slaveholder when they lay in the dark and heard the chains rattling and the songs singing and remembered, just for a moment, that the people they owned were people. Maybe Eliza Mae didn't bring anything to that plantation except a mirror, and what the Crowleys saw in that mirror destroyed them. What we know for certain is this: a woman existed. Her suffering was real. Her resistance was real. And whether through supernatural means or human ingenuity, she brought down a system that was supposed to be unbreakable. She made powerful men afraid, and in a world where enslaved people were told they were nothing, she proved that even nothing can become something terrible when pushed far enough. The Crowley plantation is gone now. The land has been reclaimed by nature. The cellar was sealed over a century ago, but if you drive through Lowndes County today, if you talk to the older residents, they'll tell you to avoid that area. They'll tell you that on certain nights, when the fog rolls in from the swamps, you can hear singing, songs in languages nobody recognizes, and they'll tell you that the water in that region tastes different. Tastes of salt, tastes of tears, tastes of memory. To this day, no one knows the truth about Eliza Mae. No one knows where she went after September 1851. No one knows if she lived to see the end of slavery in 1865. No one knows if she ever found peace, or if peace was even what she wanted. All we know is that her story survives, whispered, feared, remembered. And maybe that's what she wanted all along. Not freedom, because freedom was impossible in that world. Not revenge, because no revenge could ever be enough. But memory, to be remembered. To make sure that what happened in those fields and on those ships and in those chains was never forgotten. To become a story that couldn't be erased, a name that couldn't be silenced, a warning that echoed through generations. So I want to leave you with this question, the same one I ask at the end of every investigation. What do you believe? Was Eliza Mae a woman with genuine supernatural power, a brilliant survivor who weaponized superstition, or simply a tragic figure around whom coincidence and guilt created a legend? Tell me in the comments below. Share your theories, your experiences with similar stories, your thoughts on how history remembers those who resist. And if you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkest corners of American history. If these stories resonate with you, if you want to be part of our haunted community, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We dive deep into the forgotten, the frightening, and the forbidden every week. Until next time, remember, history is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And some stories refuse to be forgotten, no matter how deep we try to bury them. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe out there. The water remembers, and so should we.